Okay, now we're looking at Romans chapter 5, 12 to 21. As I said, it's a thicket. It's taking us a while. We'll be in it in this class, and we'll finish it next class. It's got that much stuff that I have to go through. But as I said last week, the basic point of the section's easier than the details. And the basic point is this, and it's the fact that God has justified and reconciled his enemies through the death of one man, Jesus Christ, and therefore can be counted on to save them from his wrath. That's not as strange as it may seem. You see, it means that just as there existed a death-producing connection between Adam and his own, so there exists a life-producing connection between Christ and his own. But the difficulties in the details of what Paul says. And I need to remind you of where we are in the flow of Paul's thought, or at least the things that I've presented to you, so we can pick back up. Because if you don't remember any of that, what I'm going to be saying now won't make sense. So let me, as quickly as I can, summarize or repeat what I said. So Paul says in verse 12 that sin entered into the human realm through Adam, and death followed as the byproduct of sin. Death came to Adam as God's righteous judgment on sin. And that death penalty, that sentence that was given to Adam, was, I suggested to you, best understood as total death. It involved, he died spiritually, in that he was alienated from God. He was estranged from the absolutely holy God. He died physically, in that at that moment, God withdrew his life-sustaining provision. Had Adam not sinned, God would have sustained life eternally. It was conditional. But when he sinned, he withdrew his life-sustaining provision. So from that point, his death was a certainty. He was a dead man walking, and he died eternally, in the sense that barring the restoration of spiritual life through reconciliation by forgiveness, barring that separation from God would be fixed forever at his death, he would be consigned to hell. So it's total death, and I suggested to you that's what happens to us when we sin. God sentences us to total death. We die spiritually, in that we're alienated from God, and we are condemned to die physically and eternally. In other words, for the unforgiven sinner, the one who dies in sin, even his physical death is part of his punishment for sin. Then I hasten to add, after that doesn't mean that those without sin, the unaccountable, infants and mentally incompetent, those without sin, or those who have been forgiven of their sin, it doesn't mean that they will not die physically. All humans die physically, because when Adam sinned, God withdrew his life-sustaining provision from mankind. We became, at that point, unconditionally mortal. That's why to die is to go the way of all the earth. But the difference is that those who die without sin, the unaccountable, or those who die having been forgiven of their sin, their physical death is a consequence of Adam's sin, not a punishment, not a sentence for having committed sin. Their death is a stingless death that is not to be feared, but is to be anticipated. And then Paul says in the second part here of verse 12, that in the same way it happened to Adam, he says, death spread to all people because all sinned. And with the probable majority of modern scholars, and that's Douglas Moo's assessment, the probable majority of modern scholars, I understand that phrase, all sinned, to refer to sin that people commit personally, to acts of sin. That's how I take that. Now, a major factor that drives that conclusion among the majority of modern scholars is that that's what Paul means by that verb. Paul's usage of that verb is uniform. When Paul uses that verb sin, he refers to voluntary sin that people commit themselves. And so even the Roman Catholic scholar Joseph Fitzmyer, his church tradition as a Catholic would give him every reason to read all sinned in a different way, but he insists that it, quote, refers to personal, actual sins of individual human beings. And that's largely because of what the verb means and how Paul uniformly uses it, even in Romans. In other words, just as Adam sinned and therefore was sentenced to death as God's judgment, all people after him likewise sinned and were sentenced to death as God's judgment. Death spread because Adam's descendants followed him in sinning and received the same death penalty for disobedience. Now, I've asserted that infants and the mentally incompetent, that they're not guilty of sin, that they die merely as a consequence of Adam's sin, not because they are in any way in sin. So is Paul, the question we're at the end of last class, the question is Paul saying I'm wrong there? When Paul says because all sinned, is he saying that, look, infants are in fact involved in sin? Because he says all sinned. In other words, when Paul says because all sinned, must infants and the mentally incompetent be included in the all of all sinned? Okay, now I suggest to you no. It need not be. And I agree with those who conclude that when Paul uses all here in chapter 5, verse 12, he means it in the same sense when he said all sinned in chapter 3, verses 9 to 20, and chapter 3, verse 23, where he says all sinned there. He's not including infants because infants cannot engage in the acts that Paul describes in chapter 3. He's simply not thinking of them. He means when he says all sin, that all engaged in the kinds of acts he has listed. And infants are not able to engage in those kinds of things. So I think that in 5:12, he's using all in the same sense. He means all of those of sufficient maturity or mental capacity to be accountable. And I quoted Fitzmyer, that Catholic scholar, his statement that those who insist on including infants in the all of all sinned in chapter 5, verse 12, he says they are demanding, quote, a precision, in other words, that a precision with regard to the meaning of all that Paul does not envisage. And I think that's correct. And then when the bell rang, I was reading you quotes from C.E.B. Cranfield and from Douglas Moo, two very well-known commentators. Cranfield's dead now, but very well-known commentators to the effect that Paul was thinking in terms of adults when he said all sinned, or he was or may have been thinking in the terms of adults. Okay, so that's where we are, and I want to pick back up now that Paul does not intend to include infants in the all sinned in chapter 5, verse 12. That's confirmed in my view. In other words, supported and bolstered by the fact Paul indicates elsewhere that knowledge is a key to accountability. That knowing and understanding is a predicate, a precondition for accountability. For example, when he says in Romans 1:18 to 20, because what is knowable of God is evident among them. It's clearly seen, being understood, so that they are without excuse. So this idea that there's some kind of understanding that is predicate to culpability, that is a precondition to that. He says in 132 to 2:1, though knowing God's righteous decree, those who practice such things are worthy, therefore you are without excuse. So Paul seems to me to recognize that knowledge is a prerequisite for culpability. He says in 2:14 and 15 about the law of the heart, they show the work of the law written in their hearts, as their consciences and commonly held thoughts also testify. It helps me at least to remember that children, they weren't the center of attention in ancient culture. You see, so Paul's focus on the accountable, his assuming that people would understand he's focused on the accountable, is not as strange as it may seem to us. And he's writing a letter. He's not writing a systematic theology. Like Paul doesn't start out and say, okay, here I am, I'm going to present this systematic theology, so therefore it's incumbent on me to try to answer all of these questions. He's writing a letter to them. Okay, so he doesn't go into all of that. Now, those who disagree and those who include, they say, no, all sinned includes infants. All means all. Okay, they say, look, they do that by claiming that, look, though we recognize that infants are incapable of doing acts of sin, they're incapable of sinning, they sinned in Adam. You see, that's what I mean. He's saying all sin, you got to take all as all. You say, okay, well, that means infants then too. Yeah, it means infants. You recognize infants can't engage in these sins, right? Yes, I recognize that. But it means all sinned in Adam. In other words, they believe that human beings, all humans, are born under a death sentence. They're not simply fated to die as a consequence of Adam's sin. They are born under divine condemnation. They're condemned because they share in the guilt of Adam's sin. They don't simply bear consequences of Adam's sin. They are guilty for Adam's sin. So they are sinners by proxy and are therefore worthy of divine condemnation. Okay, that's the idea. And I think it's incorrect. I think it's incorrect first because it requires that verb sin. It requires that verb to carry an idiosyncratic meaning of sin by proxy. Sin vicariously, which is not what the verb means, and that's what drives most modern scholars to reject that. But there are reasons in addition to that steer me away from that meaning. And the first is, why would Paul, in my view, spend so much energy in chapters 1 through 3 establishing that everyone was condemned because everyone committed sins? He labors to demonstrate that Gentiles and Jews alike are all guilty because they all committed sins. Why would he do that, you see, if everybody's condemned simply by being human? Why would he go through to all that trouble? Why not simply say all humans are guilty and condemned because all humans descend from sinful Adam, and be done with it? Just do a couple lines and be done with it. So that's the first thing. That doesn't seem to square with me. Second is that in Romans chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, which we will get to, but in Romans 7, 9 to 10, Paul says that at one time he was alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, sin sprang to life. Or the sin in him, sprang to life and he died. And I think it's very likely, it's debated of course, but I think it's very likely that Paul is here referring to a time in his childhood before he was accountable for obeying the law. And as soon as the law became applicable to him, when he reached whatever level of maturity there was, that he became responsible and accountable for obeying the law, well then sin, this predisposition or this inclination to sin that I'll talk about in a minute, well that then sprang into action producing transgression, violation of the law for which he was now accountable, and then consequent judgment, death. Now, if that's the correct reading there, well, Paul obviously was not born spiritually condemned. He wasn't born under that death sentence. He was born alive, and then he died when sin caused him to transgress the law. So that's another thing. And the third thing is Ezekiel chapter 18 makes it very clear to me that the guilt of the fathers is not charged against their children. That's different, you see, from the consequences. From the consequences falling on the children. They're not being punished. You see, that's different. So Ezekiel is clear to me that the guilt is not passed on, so that they are not punished for the acts of the father. For example, Ezekiel 18:20 says, the one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. And Paul, it seems, echoes this theme of personal accountability in Romans chapter 14, verse 2, when he says, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. You see, that for me eliminates this idea of Adam's guilt being passed on to us. And you see the same thing in Deuteronomy 24:16, which says, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. You say, well, what about those texts? There's a handful of texts in the Old Testament, in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that speak of God visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And I think those are warnings about the seriousness of sin, that sin is such a grave matter that God will or may punish the guilty father by extending the harmful effects of his sin to his descendants. You see, though the children may suffer, they're not being punished. Rather, they're serving as instruments of God's wrath against the rebellious father. See, part of the father's punishment is seeing what he brought on his descendants. Which is why I think that it says to the third and fourth generation. Because then we're to the great-grandparents and they're going to be dead after that. So that's what I think is going on there. Now, what happened by the time of Ezekiel, Israel had twisted this warning, as I perceive it, a warning about the gravity of sin, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children. That's to say, sin is such a serious matter. Well, they had twisted that warning about the gravity of sin. They turned it into a denial of personal accountability. They took that truth and turned it into a denial of personal accountability. God, in their case, was in fact punishing them for their own sin. But they claimed that they were merely receiving the consequence of their father's sin. This is a divine punishment on us for sin we're doing. We simply happen to be reaping the consequences of what our fathers did. That's what they meant, you see, when they would say the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. You see, what they're saying is we are simply receiving the consequence of the father's action. So they use that to deny personal accountability and responsibility for their own sin, which then cut off the need to repent. And that's why God says no more. You know, he says they were in fact being punished. And they were using that idea to dodge their own guilt. And since punishment is inflicted only on the guilty, God demanded that they stop rationalizing their guilt. That's why he says, no more are you going to say this. The fathers eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are set on edge because of what you're doing with it. Okay. Now finally, if children are born guilty because of Adam's sin, they're under divine condemnation. Well, it poses quite a dilemma. Those that die in infancy, they are either condemned to hell or they are saved apart from hearing and accepting the gospel. And I say that because as I've noted, the death that was imposed by God on Adam's sin, his judgment for sin, that was total death. It included spiritual and eternal death. And that's the death that Paul says spread to all men because all sin. So if the death of infants is this divine judgment on them for their having sin, well, it includes eternal death. It includes spiritual and eternal death, right? Now, many, of course, they say, okay, yeah, that's right. They are under divine condemnation and they would go to hell, but fortunately, they're forgiven when babies are baptized. You see, when the babies receive this infant baptism, that takes away their guilt, so they are no longer under divine condemnation. And very interestingly, I hope this is interesting, it is to me, how this came about. Infant baptism is not attested until the late 2nd century. And the way it began initially is that you had emergency procedures where you had a gravely ill child, and they would be brought, the child's at death's door, and will you do something here? And so by the time we get up into the 5th century, this then was normalized for infants to be baptized. And this very influential theologian named Augustine, he has a debate or an argument with a guy named Pelagius. And the argument is over Augustine's concept of original sin. In other words, Augustine is arguing that it's original guilt. It's original condemnation, that you are born under divine judgment because of your participation in Adam. So in his argument with Pelagius, what he does, he looks at infant baptism had been normalized by then, and he says to Pelagius, my view is correct, because otherwise, why would we baptize infants? What would be the purpose of baptizing them if they weren't condemned? Then what's interesting is, once Augustine's concept of original sin became entrenched, now he's a 5th century guy, early 400s, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, but very influential. And once his concept of original sin as original guilt became entrenched, well, then the logic of the argument was flipped. And people then said, because you are born condemned, you must be baptized as an infant. So that he used it to justify original sin. They then take original sin and use it to justify infant baptism. Okay, that's kind of a footnote. But many do say, okay, this original guilt, though, it's taken away. Now, I don't believe that infant baptism is legit. Okay, I understand many people disagree. You know, I'm well aware of that. But I don't think that an infant can be baptized according to Scripture. I don't think it is a faith commitment, or it is something done in faith where there's a confession of faith. The renowned church historian Everett Ferguson, he says the theology of baptism presented in the New Testament would seem to rule out infant baptism in spite of its long history in Catholic and Protestant churches. I agree with that. Okay, I'm what's called a credo Baptist, right? They would be pedo Baptists. Think you can baptize. I just don't think that fits with New Testament theology. I don't think it's right. But he goes on. He says, against the practice are the following facts. There's no mention of the baptism of infants in the New Testament. Every account of baptism in the New Testament shows it to be a response by believers. The evidence of church history places the beginning of infant baptism at the end of the 2nd century. Okay, so I'm saying it's a dilemma because these children who are born, they're either going to be damned or they're going to be saved in a way other than hearing and believing in the gospel. Yeah, people say, yeah, well, that's a good thing we have infant baptism then, because yes, they would be damned, but that's taken care of. But I don't think that's legit, but let's assume for the sake of argument it is. Let's assume that infants are the proper subjects of baptism. But the problem then still stands, right? For the countless infants who die without being baptized. You haven't really solved the issue, right? So they are either damned or they are saved apart from hearing and accepting the gospel. Now, there are very few proponents today of original guilt who are willing to accept the notion of infant damnation. So they argue instead that, okay, infants are or may be saved in some special way. Because they see that seems like, this child is born and dies and he goes to hell. And they say, no, we don't think that. We don't want to defend that. So what we're going to say is that, no, they're saved in some special way. But the Bible gives no hint of such a thing. You see, on the contrary, the Bible stresses that salvation comes through hearing and believing the gospel. And so if infants do in fact need salvation from sin, it just seems strange that their manner of deliverance is not addressed. But if infants are not guilty, as I think, if they're not guilty, well, then that silence is at least more understandable. Because there is no condemnation that has to be explained. James D.G. Dunn is a very well-known, famous New Testament scholar. He died 5 years ago. But Dunn says, guilt only enters into the reckoning with the individual's own transgression. Human beings are not held responsible for the state into which they are born. That's the starting point of their personal responsibility, a starting point for which they are not liable. William Lane Craig, who is a theologian and a philosopher, you've probably heard him. He has a high presence on the internet, but he's also done a lot of other things. William Lane Craig says, if you believe with Roman Catholics and Reformed and Lutheran theologians, okay? So it's not like there aren't people who disagree with me. These are large traditions that would say I'm wrong, okay? And they have, highly educated, qualified, smart theologians. And they have constructed a system that is contrary to the one I'm telling you. So, but Craig says if you believe with Roman Catholics and Reformed and Lutheran theologians that Adam's sin and guilt are imputed to every individual human being descended from Adam, then infants and the mentally disabled are going to also need salvation to be applied to them in some way because they carry the guilt of Adam's sin. On the other hand, if like me, you're not persuaded that this doctrine is biblical, then infants and the mentally retarded are not born sinful and therefore have no sin that needs to be pardoned or forgiven. So I just want you to see, I'm not the Lone Ranger, okay? I'm not giving you something that's eccentric or never heard of. This guy just think this up in his bedroom or something? Okay, this is a view that many people hold, and I think it is better. And I'm convinced that it's superior to the other. Now, though we all earn our own death sentence by committing our own sin under the view I'm telling you, the view that I think is correct. Though we all earn our own death sentence by committing our own sin, Paul's argument is more complicated than that. Okay, it's more complicated than that. If we stop there, you should be saying, well, wait a minute. You told me that the point of this thing is that just as there's a death-producing connection between Adam and his own, so there's a life-producing connection between Christ. Where's the death-producing connection? You're simply telling me Adam sins and he's condemned. They sin and they're condemned. I don't see a connection. Okay, well, that'd be right if we left it there. But Paul doesn't leave it there. His argument is more complicated. He says that we all were in some sense made sinners by Adam's sin. We were made sinners by Adam's sin, he says in verse 19. He says in verse 17 that death reigned through him. You see, through Adam. Now this indicates rather clearly that Adam's sin is in some way, in some sense, a cause of the sins that followed. It is in some sense a cause of the sins that followed. In other words, all sin after Adam is in some way tied to Adam. It is in some way a consequence of Adam's sin. And the best way to understand this, in my opinion, the best way to understand this is to realize that Adam transmitted to all his posterity, to all his descendants, a bentness or a proclivity or an inclination to sin. We are a fallen race. And though our guilt and condemnation come not from the inclination to sin, not from the bentness to sin, but from our acting on that inclination, the inclination to sin explains how our sin can be a consequence of Adam's sin and why every human has chosen sin over God. Judgment death comes as a result of personal sinning and through one man. And through one man. Now that, in my view, is preferable to forcing onto the phrase, because all sinned, an otherwise unattested sense of sinning by proxy. That's preferable. Now this understanding is held by, that I'm presenting to you, it's held by a significant number of scholars. And again, I say that just so you can take some peace that this guy's not a crank. Okay? He's just not some guy who's over here, feeding me some bizarre, eccentric stuff that I'm going to go out and find out's crazy talk. Okay? So it's held by a significant number of scholars. Colin Kruse, in his commentary, says there's now a tendency among a number of scholars, no matter how precisely they construe F-ho, that's because, to identify a primary and secondary cause for human beings becoming subject to death. The primary cause is Adam's disobedience, through which death first entered the world. And the secondary cause is the sin of disobedience of all human beings who likewise bring death upon themselves. And then he cites scholars like Cranfield. These are all very well-known theologians and commentators. Cranfield and Byrne and Fitzmyer and Dunn and Wright. He cites all of those. Adam Harwood, who wrote a book called The Spiritual Condition of Infants. Adam Harwood, in his later systematic theology, he labels the view I'm presenting to you as the inherited consequences view, which he believes is the right one. And he describes the view I'm presenting to you, he describes it this way. All people inherit the consequences of Adam's sin, such as a corrupt nature, mortality, and a fallen world. However, people become guilty and fall under God's condemnation due to their own sin alone. And then he adds, he says, this was the Christian position before Augustine. And it has been affirmed by many throughout the history of the church. Now, Augustine's 5th century. So before then, he says this was the Christian position before Augustine changed the theology of the West in the 5th century. And then we followed Augustine's, or the Catholics followed Augustine in his notion of original guilt. So I think that's significant. Douglas Moo, he describes or explains this view I'm presenting to you. Now, he rejects the view. He rejects the view, but he says the view has much in its favor. Okay, I think it has more in its favor than Moo allows. But Moo says it has much in its favor, but he goes against it. But here's how he describes the view. He says, death then is due immediately to the sinning of each individual, but ultimately to the sin of Adam. For it was Adam's sin that corrupted human nature and made individual sinning an inevitability. C.E.B. Cranfield, whose commentary on Romans, his 2-volume commentary on Romans is, in the academic world is renowned. All right, as I say, Cranfield's dead now, but this was the commentary on the Greek text of Romans. Cranfield says, according to the most probable interpretation, hamarton, sinned, refers to men's actual sinning. Death has come to all men in their turn because all men have sinned in their own persons voluntarily. But their sinning is related to Adam's transgression, not merely externally, not merely as imitation of it, not merely he did it, we did it, and so the only connection is that we did the same thing. Not merely externally, but also internally as being its natural consequence, the fruit of the desperate moral debility and corruption which resulted from man's primal transgression and which all succeeding generations of mankind have inherited. So this idea that he passed on to us this fallenness or this corruption, and that's what ties our sin to his. Donald Bloch is a very well-known theologian. He says, we become guilty of sin through our personal transgression and must not assign our guilt either to Adam or to the devil. The Bible is clear that human beings are fully responsible for their sin, and this is why they stand under the condemnation of God. That is part of divine justice. That's what you see in Ezekiel 18. The son won't be punished for the father's sin. But he says here, we cannot escape from responsibility by claiming I was born this way or the devil made me do it. Although even from conception, we are under the influence of sin. We become personally accountable when we freely assent to this bias towards sin, which theology calls concupiscence. He says we are by nature children of wrath because the virus of sin has corrupted our inner being, but our lack of resistance to this virus is what renders us culpable before God. Our essential nature is good, for we're created in God's image. Our existential nature is evil, for we have allowed the proclivity to sin to gain mastery over us. Guilt is not inherited, but the weakness that leads to sin is part of our human inheritance. So this is the idea, okay? Now, if as long as you understand what I'm saying and why I think this, okay. Now you're free, then you're going to judge and say, well, I think, I'm with the Catholics or I'm with these people or I think that's right, there's a better way to skin that cat. That's part of doing theology. I just want you to hear what I'm saying and why I think this is right. And then you see, okay? I think this is the best solution, the most that is in accord with the nature of God. But there's this question, you say, well, how does this predisposition to sin, how is this transmitted? Right? You're saying our sin is tied to Adam because somehow we receive from Adam something, a proclivity, a bentness, an inclination to sin. How is that proclivity, that bentness, that inclination transmitted through the ages? Okay, well, that's a question, right? It may be there are ideas that it's transmitted socially. It's transmitted psychologically. It's transmitted and or biologically. You see, but however it was transmitted, our sin and therefore our death sentence is in some way connected to Adam. And that's how you get to, though there's just as a death-producing effect between Adam and his own, so there's a life-producing effect between Christ and his own. Now, the social idea of transmission, that idea is that by tasting sin, engaging in it, Adam gave this sin dominance in his life. It is an addiction that cannot be broken without divine power. So all children are thus born into a corrupt, sin-twisted, and sin-addicted family and society and are inevitably bent thereby. Okay, so that's the idea, the social transmission of the corruption. The psychological idea is that when man became mortal as a consequence of Adam's sin. When Adam sinned and God cast mankind out away from the tree of life, which represents his life-sustaining provision. So when mankind became unconditionally mortal as a result of Adam's sin, well then, that person, then the anxiety and the insecurity that comes from that unconditional mortality leads to this wanting to overcome those things and compensate for those things by asserting control and independence as a reaction to that anxiety of my mortality. And so I assert this independence and I assert this control, and that leads to sin. And of course, the biological idea was expressed in that quote that I just read to you from Cranfield, is that Adam's very nature is corrupted. So the very thing that is passed down through biologically is corrupt. This corrupt nature is part of what we inherit from our parents. But there's a question here, and I see I have 1 minute and 50 seconds. So a really, I think, important question is just how it is that we are culpable, responsible, blameworthy for our sinning, so that God is just in condemning us, despite the fact we are heirs of the fallenness introduced by Adam. Right? I mean, that's a tough question. And we're nowhere told. I'd really like to have, to be able to go back and have an index and say, I want to look this up and say, where can I go to find the answer to this question? We're not told. Okay, so that gives rise to divergent speculations. Paul seems content simply to hold these truths in tension. The idea that we are in fact linked to Adam, that we inherit some kind of propensity to sin from him, and therefore we're connected to him, but that we are responsible. James Dunn, in his discussion of Paul in Romans 7, he says the issue of personal responsibility Paul tried to resolve by depicting sin as a power which fully masters the fleshly eye, without really denying the eye's part in the evil it does or exculpating its failure to do the good. So it just seems he's content to hold it in tension. Now maybe it's something like this. I'm going to have 20 seconds. Let me get this out. Just maybe, okay, I think through these things, maybe this will give us a window on the concept. But something like a drug addict, okay, who obviously has this inner disposition, like a drug addict who's surrounded by other addicts who normalize the use of drugs, surrounded by enablers who facilitate the use of drugs, surrounded by dealers who promote the use of drugs. Now, he won't necessarily use drugs, it being possible for him to choose otherwise in each specific instance, but in his state and circumstance, he sometimes will choose to use drugs. And when he does so, he will rightly be held responsible for that choice despite all the contributing factors. Okay? Now I have more to say about that, but I'm already over time. Thanks for hanging. It's just tough sledding. I know that, but hope you got your money's worth. Oops, should have hit that for you.